Thanks for listening. This is Brian Hurley from Business Performance Improvement. The podcast Lean Six Sigma Bursts are short lessons, comments, Q&A, and insights. If you have a question, send your question through the Anchor app, and we might feature you on a future episode. Or contact me at biz-pi.com.
The following presentation is a summary of the Anticoagulation Clinic Improvement Project, performed in 2006. It was funded by a government grant from AHRQ and involved all Cedar Rapids, Iowa anticoagulation clinics and hospitals. By the way, this entire podcast was spoken by AI using text-to-speech from 11 Labs from the words I wrote. I'll include a link to 11 Labs to learn more about this AI technology. The goal of the project was to determine if Lean and Six Sigma tools and techniques from other industries could be applied to these healthcare clinics to reduce the number of adverse drug events and prevent complications. For those of you unfamiliar with the role of the anticoagulation clinic, let's back up and define the problem we're trying to address. Warfarin, sold under the name Coumadin, is a powerful and effective medication for reducing the coagulation, or thinning of blood, to prevent blood complications such as deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary embolism. It also protects against stroke in people who have atrial fibrillation, valvular heart disease, or artificial heart valves. This medication must be controlled and dosed appropriately in order to prevent these complications to the patient, which can result in an adverse drug event, ADE, resulting in an emergency room visit or hospitalization, and immediate involvement from the physician. The goal of the project was to review the process for administering and monitoring those patients taking this medication. As you can see, there have been an average of 25% of total adverse drug events related to patients on warfarin. Prothrombin time, or ProTime, is measured on each patient to determine their blood clotting tendency. That number is then converted to an International Normalized Ratio, or INR value. Each patient is given an INR range, depending on various factors, which determines whether their dosages are correct or not. Adjustments are made to the patient's dosage and frequency of testing based on the INR results. Dosage changes and adjustments are made primarily on the last test result only, and there appears to be no consideration of historical test results for each patient. Normal variation in the test results are not understood and are considered special cause variation in many cases, resulting in a dosage change. Patient compliance to their medication, along with other factors like diet and exercise changes, are not always considered. Here's an example of a warfarin dose adjustment worksheet that is the current standard. The main concern is that the patient's historical INR readings are not taken into account, and therefore the individual reviewing that patient's INR reading may be making a dose change when one is likely not needed. We will go into more details about this later in the presentation.
Let me pause for a moment to tell you about our sponsor, Creative Safety Supply. Creative Safety Supply is a great resource for free guides, infographics, and continuous improvement tools. I recommend starting with their 5S guide. It includes breakdowns of the 5 pillars, ways to begin implementing 5S, and even organization tips and color charts. From red tags to floor markings, it's all there. Download it for free at creativesafetysupply.com/5S.
One of the first steps in any improvement project is to validate that the measurements we are making decisions on, the INR value, are being measured consistently. One tool to determine the validity of a measurement system is called a Gage R&R, which is short for Gage Repeatability and Reproducibility. Repeatability in the measurement means that the same person can duplicate the same INR readings if they repeat the test over and over again using the same sample under the same process and equipment. The reproducibility analysis will tell us if another person or another equipment can duplicate the readings of the same blood samples. The processes and equipment might be the same or different, depending on the assumptions for the study. In this example, the labs performing the tests in the community use the same equipment and processes, but we still want to validate that they are actually getting the same INR results. Variation exists in measurements, so getting the exact same results is not expected. A Gage R&R is said to be excellent if that total variation due to the repeatability and reproducibility is less than 10% of the specification, or in this case, a typical patient INR range, often between 2 and 3. The gauge is said to be acceptable if it is less than 30% of that range, but considered unacceptable if greater than 30%, which says that over 30% of the patient's range is being taken up by differences in the way that the blood sample is being measured. The Gage R&R we performed was focused on 10 different patients. After gaining approval from the internal review board, the study involved warfarin patients going in for testing on a randomly chosen day that gave consent to be part of the study. We divided each patient's blood sample into 6 tubes. We selected 2 different labs in the community that regularly perform these tests. 3 of those tubes were tested in Lab A, and the other 3 samples were tested in Lab B. We requested the labs run the samples every 4 hours. The first sample at 8 a.m., the second sample at noon, and the last sample at 4 p.m. The results are shown above, along with the plot of each average INR reading for each patient at each lab. The plot and analysis of the average INR value between labs shows a p-value of 0, which means there is a significant difference between lab A and B when comparing the same blood samples. The next question, is this statistical difference important or relevant? The goal is to keep patients within a therapeutic range of 2.0 to 3.0 or 2.5 to 3.5, a range of 1.0 typically. When we compared the Gage R and R variation to a typical patient therapeutic range of 1.0, we see that over 50% of the total variation is related to the measurement system. In this case, the differences between lab A and B. Note that the repeatability in samples was very consistent with each lab, so it had very little impact on the total measurement variation. Most of the variation came from reproducibility. What this means is that if the patient's true INR reading is 2.31, for example, the measurement system might read as high as 2.6 or as low as 2.1, depending on which lab they visited. This likely scenario could drastically change the nurse or physician's interpretation of whether that patient's dosage is appropriate. To summarize, the patient INR values can vary as much as 0.5 or half of the allowable therapeutic range, depending on which lab the patient visits or where their samples are sent by the clinic. The variation from the measurement could cause incorrect assumptions of patients' current INR results, which can impact their dosage levels. Those assumptions could lead to unnecessary dosage changes, giving them more or less medication than they actually need, which can increase the risk of ER admissions, adverse events, and complications. Every time a dosage change occurs, the chance of a patient or medical error greatly increases, which could lead to overdoses, incorrect doses, missed doses, and more. For the analyze phase, we needed to better understand why the labs got different results using the same blood samples, equipment, and processes. Next, we had to understand how INR is calculated. Pro time is what is actually measured from each blood sample, and that number is converted to INR with this formula. The pro time is divided by the mean nominal pro time, or MNPT. The MNPT is determined by taking a random sample of 20 non-warfarin patients, so the results are standardized. The resulting value is then taken to the power of the International Sensitivity Index, or ISI value. This is an adjustment factor provided by the reagent manufacturer to account for their variation. To broaden the study, we looked at a total of 4 labs in the community and compared their MNPT and ISI values to better understand the size of the problem and help us uncover what was happening between lab A and B. As you can see, both of the pro time values used to determine the MNPT values were different in labs A and B. Lab A was 11.4 and lab B was 11.9. These differences impacts the calibration of the test equipment. Notice that lab C and D were similar to lab A. This drew our attention to lab B being different than the other labs. Looking at the equation and by running some simulations on our Gage R and R results, the MNPT difference has a much greater effect on the overall INR value as opposed to the ISI value difference. We next investigated why there was a difference in those MNPT values. We obtained the actual test results of the patients used for the MNPT calculations at each lab. These results explain why the MNPT values are different. The next step was to organize a meeting with all labs in the area to brainstorm reasons for this difference and to come up with ideas on how to get more consistent MNPT values within the community. A fishbone diagram was used to assist in the brainstorming and facilitation of the group. Some initial recommendations based on discussions with lab personnel and our data analysis indicate that 20 samples may not be enough based on the wide variability in non-warfarin patient readings. Although not an issue in this example, it is recommended that statistical techniques for identifying outliers be employed whenever averages are used, especially when determining MNPT values. We also suspect that there are actual measurement differences or bias in the calibration or performance of similar lab test equipment that needs to be investigated. We also identified issues with the age selection of non-warfarin patients, as Lab B mentioned that they use younger staff members instead of people closer to the age of warfarin patients, a much older demographic. One recommendation suggested that we would also consider combining the MNPT results from all labs in the area so that everyone uses the same number. The community ultimately decided to switch to a more consistent reagent called Innovin to reduce the measurement variation between labs. We mentioned earlier that historical data should be used to determine how the patient's recent test results compared to their prior results. One of the key tools in Lean Six Sigma is a control chart which displays historical data on a chart along with its statistical limits to help separate a potential issue or special cause from random variation in the INR results. These special causes can be situations such as missed doses, excessive vitamin K, or too much alcohol. These charts also help identify when to modify the frequency of testing. We won't get into the details of statistical process control or training on control charts in this presentation. Here's an example of an actual patient's INR results created with the patient anticoagulation software INR Pro. Let's go over the color coding system on the control chart. The yellow area denotes the limit area, typically called the control limits. It is based upon the historical standard deviation of the INR tests. The limits are set at approximately 3 standard deviations from the average, where the average was 2.37 for this particular patient. The control limits give a predicted range of values in the future. And in this case, we predict that the patient will be somewhere between 0 and 5.8, which is far wider than their expected therapeutic range, which is the green area. The patient has a therapeutic range between 2 and 3. The red area is outside the statistical limits and an indication of a special cause or unusual situation. INR results in that range likely indicates something specific happened to result in a reading outside of the yellow area. Nurses and physicians investigate why the patient had a reading so high. As you can see, the INR readings are all over the place. There is a reading of 5.7 on March 29, 2005. It was not considered abnormal because of all the variation in the other readings. Most protocols suggest immediate action for someone with an INR over 5. And this patient has been above 5 twice in 1 year and had one reading around 4.5. Perhaps this isn't such an abnormal reading for this patient after all. This is what we would call normal variation, not something unusual. On the prior chart, according to this worksheet, you can see that a dosage change would have been made where we circled the red data point. It was between 1.5 and 2. And with the patient INR range of between 2 and 3, the chart above recommends a potential increase in dosage of 10%. Every time a dosage change is made, there is an increased risk that the patient does not receive or implement the dose change correctly. For example, it adds too much or too little to his or her ideal dosage. This results in an increased risk that the dosage change will have a negative consequence on the patient, such as bleeding, adverse drug events, or hospitalization. With the average age of warfarin patients around 70 years old, any changes to their established patterns and habits can cause new problems. What we were discovering is that some of these dosage changes may not be necessary based on the SPC chart. On the prior chart, we see that the circled point is not abnormally high or low, and it is actually right in line with prior readings. Our knowledge of statistical process control tells us that we can actually induce more variation in the process, in this case the patient's INR readings, by making slight adjustments to their dosage based on random or common variation. Random variation can only be determined by using historical data and statistically based limits generated from a control chart. Here are some additional patient examples for you to look at. After reviewing hundreds of patients over the years, we've been unable to find more than a few patients that can consistently maintain their INR readings within the green area, which could suggest one of two things. Number one, the patient needs additional training on this medication in order to better control their results. Or two, the patients are not capable of staying within this tight range of INR values. Perhaps the expected ranges are unrealistic. Hopefully this study will result in additional steps to investigate some of the questions and concerns we've uncovered.
Whether you work in a manufacturing company, at a hospital, within a government agency, or volunteer at a nonprofit organization or NGO, continuous improvement is necessary and essential. For the past 25 years, I've been helping organizations implement Lean and Six Sigma methods into their culture. And I've compiled all this knowledge into the 7 best practices that are essential to any organization. If you sign up with your email, you will receive a link to the YouTube video, you will receive an audio podcast, and a summary document you can download. The video takes less than 30 minutes to listen to, and it will help you fully leverage the power of these methods and ensure your organization has a solid improvement culture and foundation. Go to biz-pi.com and look for the 7 Continuous Improvement Best Practices document.